The American Teilhard Association podcast features conversations and interviews which explore the life, thought, and vision of mystic scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. We express our gratitude to Daylesford Abbey in Paoli, Pennsylvania, for allowing us to use their space and equipment in making this episode possible. Dr. John Haught, PhD, holds the title of Distinguished Research Professor from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where he taught in the Theology Department from 1970 through 2005. His area of specialization is systematic theology, with a particular interest in issues pertaining to science, cosmology, evolution, ecology, and religion. Haught is one of today's foremost scholars of Teilhard, science, and religion, and has authored over 20 books on these topics. Welcome, everyone, to the American Teilhard Association podcast. We are grateful to have with us today Dr. John Haught. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Andrew.
Yeah, it's great to reconnect with you again. We were together in person with Sister Kathy and so many other members of the American Teilhard Association and friends back in Pennsylvania here in October. So it was great to be with you then and great to reconnect with you now.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. So Dr. Haught is one of the foremost scholars on Teilhard and Teilhardian thought. So we'd like to explore today, John, kind of your journey with theology and finding Teilhard and where that's led you in life. So what initially drew you to study theology?
Well, it's not so much that anything drew me as I was sort of pushed into it because I was too young to resist. Anyway, my local pastor in Virginia, I grew up on a farm there, came out to my parents' farm one night and took me aside and said, "How would you like to go to the seminary?" At the time, I was only 13 years old, and I didn't know what a seminary was. I hardly knew anything about anything, but it sounded like it might beat working on the farm. So at the age of 13, I entered a minor seminary in Catonsville, Maryland, and it was there for the first time I was initiated into what I like to call the medieval worldview. I had come from the farm, which was kind of Neolithic in a way, and I suddenly found myself in the medieval world of Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics. And I didn't get to that thought explicitly until I was in college, but I joined the seminary, which had a kind of medieval asceticism about it. And that's why I say I was launched into the Middle Ages, as it were, because the kind of piety and spirituality and theology that shaped that world was still that of the Middle Ages. And that's the spirituality, that's the climate which shaped my spirituality and my thought for almost 10 years that followed, because not much changed in those 10 years, except my own feelings and my own eventual realization that I was not cut out to be a priest. That I didn't have that kind of a vocation. But by the time I left the seminary, Second Vatican Council had taken place, and my mind and my heart and everything else was suddenly launched into the modern world. I was in college, I think, when the Second Vatican Council took place, and it had a great impact upon me, which we can talk about later on. But that's how I came to like theology. As I look back, I think what made me eventually enter into theology as a professional, as a worldview, and as a lifestyle was things that happened in the Second Vatican Council, which, as I look back now, were initiated very much in the mind and heart and spirituality of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And so after I left the seminary, I had already been hooked by his love of the earth, which I had felt uncomfortable with from the beginning.
Mm.
I grew up on a farm and I loved the land and I loved the earth. And so when I went into the seminary as a 13-year-old, I didn't know it at the time, but I was being asked to detach myself from all that had nurtured me and given me a zest for living before I entered the seminary. And so when I finally came across the writings of Teilhard, when I was in first and second year of theology in the major seminary, I found somebody who expressed feelings that I had suppressed for many, many years. And as you might know, Teilhard himself was beset by a similar type of dilemma. When
Yes.
he was in the seminary, he was torn between whether he should spend time digging up bones and rocks, which appealed to him for many reasons, or should he adopt the kind of spirituality descended from Aquinas and others in the Middle Ages, which would have been enticing. And I felt the same thing. I was enraptured by the
Mm.
medieval worldview.
Mhm.
It was in many ways an adventure that I'd never anticipated. And it had a beauty about it, kind of static, vertical, hierarchical, pre-scientific beauty about it, a sacramental quality to it that appealed to something deep in my heart too. So what Teilhard did was give expression to what I was feeling. And once he taught me, or I picked up this through his writings and other sources, that you can love the earth without feeling that you have to turn your back on God.
Mhm.
You can love God without detaching yourself so severely from time and
Mhm.
matter, and that you can love matter and time without feeling that you have to turn your back on God. That was a revolution in my own thinking and my own spiritual life, to which I am this day still deeply indebted.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that journey. And yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of, being a 13-year-old boy, you're just so much in your body at that point, right? You have all this
But so,
energy, your
yeah,
hormones are starting to kick in, body's starting to change a little bit. But I just think of my sons who aren't, they're younger than 13, but it's natural for them to be outside and be like muddy and
yes,
in the earth in that way. And
yes,
then here you're going from being raised on a farm as a 13-year-old boy
yeah,
to kind of like this world of the head and the mind where it's this medieval world.
yes.
And what a jump. So did you take kind of naturally to that, or was it a sharp
Well,
transition for you?
what drew me to the seminary? I was already a pretty good basketball player. I'm 6'4", and I had to play outside in county of Culpeper, Virginia, because there weren't many gyms and we didn't have one at the farm.
Mhm.
But they promised that there were two basketball courts, indoor basketball courts, and immediately my heart started racing. I can live with that. Maybe that will keep me inside my body for a while, and so that was very important in my life in the seminary. I developed very, very close friendships, which I still have with other 6'4" guys that I would play around basketball with, and so that really did help me from a human point of view
Yeah.
put up with a lot of the discipline that 13 and 14-year-olds rankle against. So I eventually made peace with that and with that spirituality. And
Okay.
I carried that all the way through high school and all the way through college. And 2 years after college, when the Second Vatican Council was taking place, and that came to my aid. And gave me an excitement and a spiritual just atmosphere or discipline that I could live with.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it humanizes it
Yes.
and embodies it. Yeah. So at what point on your journey did you encounter Teilhard, and how did you encounter him?
Well, he sort of snuck up on me and grabbed hold of me while I wasn't looking. Because when I was in first year of theology, I was about 22 years old. I became familiar with what was going on in Vatican II, or the kind of conversations and books being written and articles being written that shaped Vatican II. And I realized later on, not at the time, that Gaudium et Spes, the Constitution, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, was peppered throughout with Teilhardian motifs, so much so that the great Jesuit theologian Henri de Lubac said after the council that the council, or that document, accomplished precisely what Teilhard was looking for.
Wow.
So that gave me a sense of authenticity, because I was not deviating from church teaching, as many people still think I am when I talk about Teilhard, as you know. It gave me a sense that I've carried through all my life, that I did not have to move at all beyond the boundaries of Catholic orthodoxy, Catholic teaching, in order to spend my life understanding and developing and spreading the ideas of Teilhard.
Right.
And there are certain lines within that document that are still with me. One of them was, we have to realize, I'm paraphrasing here, that we now live in an evolutionary worldview, that the modern worldview has switched from medieval to a modern scientific sense of things evolving, things moving. And it went on to say that theology's role must be to develop and interpret this sense of a new worldview, and let its doctrine and its teaching take into account the fact that we are living in a completely different perspective from that of the Middle Ages.
Right.
And it also said that hope for life everlasting should not diminish our commitment to the earth, but it should intensify our commitment to the earth. Understanding, of course, that the earth, which was Teilhard's metonymy for universe, that was his entrance into the universe, that the universe itself is still coming into being. And that's the great insight that Teilhard had. So much so that he said that the understanding that science has now given us of a universe that's still coming into being, that's a story rather than a state, should change everything in our thinking about God, the sacraments, Christian life, and especially about our moral duties. And that's how I have interpreted it. And I'm still trying to adhere to that program, that suggestion, imperative, really, that the Catholic theology has to update itself in terms of this new worldview. And so it was through the council and its influence on it, not really heavy influence, but slight influence on the theology that I was studying in the seminary back in 1965. The council ended in 65. And it's that sort of atmosphere that I found when I went from the seminary to Catholic University. Now, it might sound ironic, because Catholic University today is very conservative in its theological elements for the most part. There are always exceptions, of course. But at the time I entered in fall of 66, it was a very wide open atmosphere. I didn't enter the Department of Seminary Theology, but a Department of Religion and Religious Studies that had been shaped by Gerald Sloyan, and it set up a separate PhD program for people who are going to teach theology, but were not necessarily going to be priests or ministers.
Okay.
And so I entered that department, and it's there that for the first time I was encouraged by several of my teachers to steep myself in Teilhard de Chardin. One of them had recently written a thesis on Teilhard's theology of God in the world. and I had him as a teacher. And I was also reading Jürgen Moltmann in about the same time. And what happened was that two of them coalesced in my mind to turn me toward the future in my thinking about God and the orientation that a Christian life can have in the world. So, and then from then on, I started dabbling more and more in Teilhard.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point that you make as a theologian. Your work is so important in terms of focusing on an evolutionary theology, because although our modern world, for the most part, exists within that scientific mindset, our spirituality and our theology is way back in the Middle Ages for so many people. In my current role as the director of the retreat center at Dalesford Abbey here in Pennsylvania, I encounter a lot of different people with a lot of different spiritualities. I mean, the Norbertine community here has its own, assemblage of spiritualities within it that make up a whole. And it's just really interesting to encounter people where they are, which is our pastoral call in that way, to meet people where they are in the way that Jesus did. But sometimes you get that sense of how people are spiritually living a few hundred years ago, as opposed to, being more congruent spiritually with their worldview. And I mean, I'm talking about some people that I know that are very bright. They're scientists, they're engineers, yet that spirituality is at a time that's pre-chemistry even.
Very insightful. It's very true. And it's because of that issue of how our spirituality seems to have diverged from our lived experience intellectually and in the world that Teilhard himself felt. And what attracted me to him was that he expressed the problem in words that I didn't have available to me at the time. He called it the problem of the two faiths, faith in God up above, or faith in the future of the world, and how to combine those into a holistic and consistent theology. And what allowed him to do it was the miraculous discovery of evolution.
Yes.
The fact that not only life evolves, but that the whole cosmos was in the process of becoming something different. And the age of what deep time can do to a universe in terms of transformation.
That's right.
And what happened, Teilhard eventually felt that we have to feel in ourselves, since we're part of this self-transforming universe, we have to feel that process of transformation in order to be faithful to the earth. But at the same time, if we come to the conclusion, as many of his scientific colleagues did, that nature is all there is, scientific naturalism, he felt that that was very unsatisfying too, because ultimately it implies that there's nothing really that matters. If the universe is condemned to absolute death, as it seems to many scientists it is, even if it takes trillions and trillions of years, he felt that if at the end, nothing of my work, nothing of my life, nothing of the great tribulations and struggles of humankind and the animal world, nothing of evolution remains, if it all goes down the abyss of nothingness, as it seems to be condemned to by the laws of thermodynamics. And then he said, if I really believed that, I couldn't have the incentive to do the slightest work. Why would I get up tomorrow? And I had the same feeling, and I still do.
Yeah.
But if at the end of everything, absolute death awaits the universe, then what are the implications of that for my moral life, for my activity? And so he thought that as a postulate of vigorous moral activity, we have to posit an omega, an endpoint, point of convergence of everything that sums up the whole universe and that sustains it everlastingly. Unless there's something like that that acts in that providential, caring way toward what happens in the universe, then
Mhm.
it raises severe questions about the worthwhileness and about the truth of faith. So um, he thought, I think, that the greatest truths are not things that are found by empirical investigation or by mathematical uh, conclusions. The greatest truths are postulates,
Mm.
not things that can be proven. So there's a wager involved at the very beginning of his thought, and it's one that I now see more clearly than ever, especially given the spread of cosmic pessimism in
Mm.
intellectual culture. That's the default position of so much intellectual elitism today. If you read the New York Times science section, or if you read books that are coming hot off the press by scientifically informed writers, they're almost inevitably, although there are some exceptions, pessimistic in their view of the universe. So what Teilhard did that buoyed me when I was a kid, almost, when I was in my early 20s, and which I still cling to with great love, is the sense that the universe is is headed towards something
Mm.
important.
Mhm.
It's something really good, alongside all the evil and struggle and suffering is going on. That the universe itself gives us every reason to be hopeful. Because look at the history. Look at the history of the universe. It awakened
Mhm.
to life 10 billion years ago. And then it eventually, very recently, awakened into thought.
Mm.
So, what we have here, what we are born into, is a universe that's already awakening. And yes, that awakening took time, but that awakening gives value to all the billions of years that have gone into the making of minds, to the bringing about of thought. So, if people ask you, why do you trust in the universe? It's a very interesting, trustworthy universe. Look, without our human complicity at all, it awakened.
Mhm.
Uh, awakened. My question then, and this was my main question in theology now, awakened to what?
Mm.
Uh, it didn't just awaken to us because we ourselves are part of that awakening.
Right.
And so everything that goes on in human consciousness, from sentience to thought, is something very splendid and very beautiful. And so our vocation has to be to continue that awakening of the universe. And that's not one that's taught to our students in universities. Teilhard is almost alone in thinking thoughts like this. But it seems to me that they are so right on, and that we neglect them only because of irrationality,
Mhm.
that I could talk about. But it's that sense of an awakening universe that gave me cause and hope to
Mhm.
continue that process. And I think education, and in fact, all of human culture can have a meaning if we see it as continuing that awakening.
Yeah.
If you see it as awakening to
Mm.
infinite goodness, truth, meaning, beauty, then that gives the universe a purpose that was there before we came along. And that we can have the purpose in our own lives of sustaining that beautiful process of awakening. And if you want proof that it's awakening, you look at your own mind right now as I'm talking. you're trying to you're trying to wonder, or listeners are trying to wonder whether what I'm talking about is complete nonsense or whether it makes sense. Well, the very fact of asking that question means
Mm.
that those minds are awakening. They're thirsting for not just understanding, but right understanding. Uh, they could probably understand what I'm saying here, but if they then ask the question, is that right?
Mm.
That shows that truth has already grasped hold of you.
Yeah.
You are already a disciple, as it were, of uh, the coming of infinite being, truth, goodness, and beauty toward us from the future.
Hmm.
So what Teilhard allowed me to do theologically was to switch from thinking of God primarily as a designer or a cosmic engineer or as a first cause, which is
Hmm.
the way so much Christian theology is still carried on, to the question of where is it going? What is attracting it? Why didn't it? Why didn't it just stay still? Why didn't the hydrogen atoms and helium atoms at the beginning just say, we're just fine here? We can last forever. But they didn't last forever in that solitude. Something stirred the process up. Not something in the area of efficient or material cause, but in the area of more like final cause or purpose that doesn't compel but persuades. And that's the fundamental vision Teilhard had. God does not operate a retro, that is from behind, pushing the universe into being, but operates the way love does, not coercively, but persuasively, luring the cosmos and allowing the cosmos an indeterminacy, which allows it to go down blind alleys, uh, but which it doesn't make the universe a design like the intelligent design anti-Darwinians would like to think. But it does allow the universe to be a drama of awakening.
Hmm.
And that's where we should look for God, not pushing things like an engineer, but opening up the space, as it were, for the universe to become something other, something autonomous in a way, something self-creative.
Hmm.
And that was the great shift in theology that grabbed hold of me when I was even in the seminary
Hmm.
and not really very fully acquainted with Teilhard. But I started reading books about him, and somebody as a gift, a departing gift from St. Mary's Seminary when I decided to leave after two theology, a great friend of mine, Richard Lawrence, who was a pastor in Baltimore for many years, a wonderful man, gave me as a departing gift a copy of Teilhard's book, The Future of Man. And so I started reading it that summer.
Okay.
And I said, this is what I want. And so I decided to go to graduate school in theology at Catholic U.
I love how you asked that question of what did the universe awaken to and how do we continue that awakening?
Yeah.
Because that resonates on so many levels and it's a very integral questioning, right? Line of questioning. It's not specific to like theology or a spiritual worldview or a scientific worldview, psychological worldview. It keeps going on, right? It's very inclusive and integral in the way that calls us to think. Um, and yeah, I mean, you mentioned how it's not being taught in universities and the colleges, but I'm even thinking too how it's not being preached from the pulpit. So much of, at least in my experience of, the Catholic Mass and what priests have to speak about during their homily is really about, how do you serve your neighbor, how do you save your soul, and not about how do we serve the larger world, or in Teilhard's inference, the universe, and how do we save the world for that much. Yeah.
That's a very good point. And Teilhard was aware of that too. And he came to the conclusion fairly early in his life that we're really not going to have a robust moral life, that we're not going to be committed to action to save our world, to help our neighbor, until we realize that we have to, first of all, have a zest for living.
Hmm.
He thought that Catholic moral teaching had lost its sense of being connected with life. So life became for him a metaphor for what is happening in the universe. And life means simply becoming more. Unless you're striving for something more, you fall back into lethargy
Hmm.
and passivity. So So in order to have a zest for living in our lives, the universe has to be such that something more and fuller is constantly coming in to that universe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only our sense that something more lies up ahead that could fully energize our zest for living, without which we can't have a serious moral life as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way in which his thought developed. You can't just expect by teaching commandments
Mm-hmm.
that people are going to behave themselves. They have to have something to live for.
Yeah.
But the culture, the intellectual culture that we live in today, and which contemporary theology has still not done anything to dispel, is that the universe is not going anywhere, that the universe is doomed to death,
Mm-hmm.
to put it bluntly.
Yeah.
And we've interpreted science, especially the laws of thermodynamics, in such a way as to make that death inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
That the notion of entropy, which Teilhard was fully aware of, but which he didn't develop sufficiently in his own thought,
Mm-hmm.
implies that there is an irreversible loss of energy available to do work.
Mm-hmm.
Work such as bringing about chemical complexity, biological complexity. All that takes great energy. But one of the laws of physics, and I have to adhere to this too, is that the amount of energy available to do work is on the decline, whereas entropy, which is the measure of the amount of energy no longer available to do work, is on the rise.
Mm-hmm.
And so scientists and philosophers look at that loss of available energy and interpret it to mean that sooner or later everything is going to come to nothingness, that there won't be enough energy even to have a thought.
Mm-hmm.
A fellow named Dennis Overby, a good writer for the New York Times, wrote an article several years back in which he maintained that eventually, if you think about all this, thought will disappear from the universe. And what a sad thing that would be. But he says that's what we have to expect, and we have to live with that. But that kind of thinking, the cosmic pessimism, does nothing to give us a zest for living or for giving us a reason to act, or at least a good reason to act. And so we have to realize that entropy somehow does not mean purposelessness. And Teilhard already saw that. He didn't develop this, but I've developed it in my own thoughts about Teilhard, that what entropy does is something absolutely indispensable for an awakening universe. It provides the element of irreversibility
Mm-hmm.
that gives the universe the element of irreversible time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, energy is depleting, but that depletion is actually essential for irreversibility, temporal irreversibility. And the thing about time and its irreversibility is that it makes possible stories.
Mm-hmm.
Stories, any story, this is the one I'm telling about my life, could not happen unless time were irreversible.
Yeah.
And so what Teilhard tells his fellow scientists, and they haven't listened, and what he tells theologians also, and they haven't listened either, is that the most important discovery of modern science is that the universe is a story.
Mm.
And the thing about a story is it can carry meaning. This is how humans get a sense of meaning. Look back through history, and all the big questions were addressed by stories about origins, how this and that happened, and what we have to do to remain true to reality. Now, the big story is the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we each have our own story, but we would not have it were it not for the fact that the universe, which gave birth to us, is already a story, and stories can carry meaning. But this story, the universe story, is still being told. It's still undergoing transformation. The universe is, and so what we need to keep asking now, but which we didn't ask in the Middle Ages, and it was Teilhard who convinced me that this is right. The big question theologically is what is going on in the universe.
Mm.
To what is this universe awakening?
Mm.
And there's where theology needs to put its focus. Instead, most theology of creation is focused on the beginning and speculated about what the beginning was like. But Teilhard said, you'll never get hold of beginnings. That's something that human minds can't do. But what you can do is ask where things are going, and is my life contributing to that? So the source of morality, the source of moral obligation, is not divine commandments planted in our hearts, like Kant said, but the fact that we are born as part of a stream that's been flowing for a long, long time. And what we should, to understand that stream, we should not look at the delta, at the tributaries that came into the fashioning of big rivers like the Nile or Mississippi, but look up ahead toward the end. I think I'm using the wrong word, delta, but look toward where it is all going. And we can't see that. We can see where it came from, the tributaries, to some degree. And we can keep investigating that, and science is very good at taking us back toward beginnings. That's what scientists are looking for. And the assumption behind that is that if you know how things began, you will understand them. Teilhard says, no, it's not that way at all. You can look back toward the beginning to get some useful information, to get a sense of patterns of physical activity, how physical activity originated. But the real question is, where is it going? And that's a question that science, for the most part, is not interested in, and theology, for the most part, is not interested in. But what theology does to try to keep people's attention is to point them out of time into eternity. It invites us to detach ourselves from the world, which means detach yourself from time. And this is the result of the Platonizing of theology and Christianity, which started long, long ago. We have to realize that there's other ways of reading the universe other than the materialist way, which looks to the past, or to the, I call it the analogical way, that sees the meaning of nature as simply pointing as imperfect analogies to the perfect world outside of time, and which invites a spirituality which asks us to detach ourselves from time. And instead, we should be asking, as the basis of our spiritual lives, where is it all going? And realize that the universe is, for all we know, it's 13.8 billion years old. We know that. But that could end up being the dawn, just the dawn of this story. And there are scientists who are beginning to realize that and are asking questions about the long-range future of things. But if Teilhard were here and I were to ask him, where is it going? He would say, well, abstractly speaking, I call it omega. But the problem with omega is it's not yet. And we can't put our minds firmly on what is not yet, but we can turn our hearts in that direction and have hope that something new is coming to meet us from up ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're continuing kind of this theme throughout our conversation here of the challenge today in our modern age, postmodern age, of these different worldviews and how there is a call for within this awakening some sort of synthesis. Um, Talking real quick about beginnings, when you were first getting started at Georgetown, and I know you commented on your experience at Catholic as a student, but when you were first getting started as a professor at Georgetown, what was the collective reception of Teilhard's thought and evolution like? I mean, were other people thinking this way, or did you find yourself kind of on an island?
No, very few people were thinking this way, and even fewer are today, I'm afraid
Yeah.
to say. But back then, there were two main forces of opposition to Teilhard's cosmic optimism. And one of them, the most forceful one in the intellectual world, was that of scientific materialism.
Okay.
And the belief, or atomism, the belief that to understand anything, you have to analyze it. You have to take it apart. So you take a human mind and you point out how the brain is necessary and physical movements in the brain are accompanying your every thought. And then you analyze that brain and you find it's made up of nerve cells and molecules. And then you start analyzing those molecules and cells, and you find they're reducible to chemical elements. That means, therefore, that if you're analytically and materialistically inclined, that your mind is essentially mindless stuff.
Yeah.
And common sense would seem to want to raise a question about that. And so what scientists, neuroscientists, and others have been doing is to try to explain how something mindless and lifeless can bring about something alive and thoughtful, like the human brain, as it were. But you see, again, they're starting from the past,
Right.
and assuming that the answer lies back there
Mm.
in the inviolable laws of nature, plus elements which somehow were there in the beginning. But Teilhard pointed out that's incoherent. What you're doing is taking something that can do marvelous things like comprehend and understand and love and so forth, and you're saying it's nothing but lifeless and mindless stuff. That's not coherent. That's incoherence. What you're taking is something coherent like the mind and reducing it to lifeless, mindless plurality of atoms or subatomic particles. So you're not finding coherence, you're finding incoherence when you go back that way. So what Teilhard suggests is, again, if you want to understand mind, turn around 180 degrees after you've gotten back to the beginning and start marching forward in time up till now. And what you'll see is things coming together into more and more coherent entities. Eventually, the human brain. Coherent, but also almost infinitely complex.
Mm-hmm.
But it's only something that's attracting the elements that can explain why they eventually become a mind that can think, that can be oriented toward goodness, truth, beauty, meaning. Look toward the future.
Mm-hmm.
And well, you will apply, but the future's not here. Teilhard would say, that's right. It's not yet in some way or another. And it's in that direction of what is not yet that we need to rethink theology, our
Mm-hmm.
ideas of God. In some sense, it's because God is not yet
Mm-hmm.
that the world evolves and that we need theology to account for what's happening. So that was one opposition, and that the materialist opposition was expressed classically in a book that I had my students read by Jacques Monod called Chance and Necessity. Monod was a Frenchman also, like Teilhard was, but he came down very, very hard on Teilhard because Teilhard was not willing to explain mind materialistically. So So he appealed to most scientific and philosophical thinkers at
Mhm.
the time. His book, Chance and Necessity, became a bestseller. And he has a whole chapter, or at least a steady number of remarks about Teilhard. And he considered Teilhard to be a loser uh,
Mm.
intellectually. And so
Mhm.
did Daniel Dennett, uh, the American version of Bertrand Russell, you might say. He was that important. He died recently, but he also called Teilhard a loser.
Mm.
And so that was the dominant intellectual setting
Mhm.
into which Teilhard's ideas had come. There were earlier generations of materialists who convicted him of being uh, of not being sufficiently lucid in his explanation of life and mind. That was one faction of resistance. The other
Mhm.
faction, which still remains, is the one that's rooted in Thomistic thought and or in some other version of medieval thought. Uh, to most theologians in our seminaries today, the majority of them, I would say, are still trying to promote that medieval worldview. And chief among them, I think, is the Bishop Barron uh,
Mm.
of the who founded an institute called Word on Fire, and that's still considered by the conservative theologians to be the only way of making sense of science, the
Mm.
Thomistic way. But the Thomistic way, as Teilhard pointed out and proved to me many years ago, is simply incapable by itself of articulating the meaning of nature, of what's really going on in nature. And so that's why I've clung to Teilhard. And I associate his worldview with the Abrahamic motif
Mhm.
that in which God is pictured as someone who comes out of the future and calls Abraham and later the people of Israel and later the early Christians, calls them into a new future, and which formulates the appropriate Christian prayer, Maranatha, come, Lord Jesus. So the real Jesus is not necessarily the one that historians analyze, take apart. That's very interesting and very important. But the real Jesus is the Jesus of the Eucharist,
Mhm.
of the banquet, of the anticipation of the final banquet. So our liturgy has motifs of anticipation and Abrahamic theology. And if you accept the idea that lex credendi, lex orandi, that the law of understanding things is set by how we pray, then Teilhard's vision is amply justified by each Mass that people go to, where we ask God, we ask for the coming of Jesus from the
Mhm.
future into the present. So I don't think what I'm doing is theologically aimless or a mistake. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, very few Catholics' minds and spiritualities are shaped by an anticipatory worldview. And the intellectual world is still stuck in the reductionist, materialist way of thinking. And whereas the religious world is still allured, I call it, has an addiction to eternity, that
Mm.
is, an addiction to finding our way out of time uh, into eternity.
Mhm. Mhm.
Doesn't give time a chance, whereas Teilhard does.
Yeah.
Yeah, things happen slowly, but there was never anything worthwhile that came about without our waiting for it. So
Mm.
waiting has become, in my theology of nature, a fundamental theme. And it's also a very biblical theme because you read in the Psalms and the prophets constantly uh, little prayers to the effect that, or observations that only those who wait uh, will not be put to shame.
You know, Jack, that resonates with me so much because I'm thinking of the words of one of my doctoral mentors, Father Frank Berna, who talked about how, especially in his experience at LaSalle University, which in the only section of Philadelphia is not in the best area of the city, and there's a lot of surrounding poverty and struggle. And he made this point. It was simple but poignant that the poor know how to wait. And and anyone of any sort of the slightest affluence, and God, we hate to stand in the grocery line or whatever, and we're the
Right,
most important person and we should be taken first, and God forbid we should have to wait for public transportation or something.
right.
It just says so much about that, the mindset that we're called to as Christians or just as human people in terms of solidarity. I mean, I'm even hearing themes of like the severance of nature within that. Like nature is a sometimes very long and arduous process to accomplish whatever it seeks to accomplish. For a seed to grow to a flower, right? Has to endure a lot. And how so much of our faith is, for a lot of people, escapism and Jesusism, and that focus is not on that Christ of the Eucharist, like you said, and the Jesus of the Eucharist. And yeah, that just really resonated with me when you brought that up. So you've spoken a lot about Teilhard's influence, especially when you were a younger man, and kind of coming into your own as a theologian. So I mean, who beyond Teilhard's intercession, who continues to inspire you now, or what themes inspire you? You mentioned this theme of an anticipatory theology. Would you mind to say a little bit more about that, or maybe people that influence you now?
Yeah, I think one of the most important influences on my life as a theologian began to occur when I was still a student at Catholic University. And that was just about the time that Jürgen Moltmann, at Moltmann, his book, The Theology of Hope, had just been translated into English. And I read that as part of a doctoral seminar that I had at Catholic University. And what he was saying is that authentic Christian faith is always willing to wait, um, not passively, but by realizing that our contemporary wishes and desires may not be implemented. Thank goodness, because there's something larger that awaits us. And so he thought that Christian theology is primarily hope. He didn't even use the word faith. Christianity is hope. And at the same time, I had been reading Teilhard, who had the idea that uh, the world, as he put it, rests on the future as its sole support. And things like that transformed my whole understanding of faith to include hope for the universe to become something. That's where really important things are happening in the universe. After all, look, it was the universe that created you and me, that created your mind, so forth. It's been doing some marvelous things without our involvement. It's
Mhm.
been doing something really, really beautiful and good, but it hasn't been forced. It hasn't been coerced.
Mhm.
So that idea that the universe is not forced and coerced was solidified in my mind shortly afterwards by my reading of Alfred North Whitehead.
Okay.
So his thought, and especially his book, Science in a Modern World, which I started using very early in my stay at Georgetown. I taught a course almost every semester on science and religion, and it was his book that, as much as any other, even perhaps intellectually speaking, even more than Teilhard, allowed me to realize that the universe is still coming into being, and that we had to anticipate in order to make our minds proportionate to this process. That the world is process, and relationality became important motifs in Whitehead's thought, and that ran parallel to my orientation from earlier on toward
Mhm.
Teilhard's anticipatory vision. So I linked Moltmann and Teilhard and Whitehead together into what I now call an anticipatory theology. Among them, I would say that Teilhard provided personally the most inspiration. When people would ask Moltmann, doesn't anticipating the future uh, take away from, subtract from the value of the present? And aren't we losing our existence, our grounding in the present, if we're constantly hoping for something in the future? And he had a very interesting answer, which I think Teilhard at least would approve of, and that's that the happiness you're looking for, the happiness of the present,
Mhm.
is anticipation.
Mhm.
The present can't absorb the fullness of the future. There has to be a distance.
Mhm.
If the present were filled with the presence of God completely, everything would be brought to an end, to almost to a kind of lethargy, to a death, as it were. There would be no future.
Mhm.
So having a sense of the future is the happiness of the present. That's the only thing we can really hope for. If we ask for God to fill up the present moment, there would be no future.
Yeah.
Everything would be pushed into the past and present. And humans cannot live except with a zest for life, and that zest is hope, hope for
Mhm.
the future. I guess we could go on and on about that, but that was the main resistance, or one of the main uh, questions that came up. Happy, how can you be happy in the present? So,
Yeah, and Teilhard's life is a testament to that, considering how much struggle he endured from his time in the war to everything he had to go through after that with his own religious order in Rome regarding his thought and being stifled and being able to share that, and how he still struggled to share it despite anything that was trying to stymie that. So there is a profound message in there when we see how central hope and anticipation are within his thought. And you
yeah.
just speak to that so with such authority and such clarity too. Um, so what would you say is something from Teilhard's thought that is most challenging for you in this time in your life?
um, I think that what's challenging to me is the question of how or whether Catholicism uh, can exist into the future. What has to happen to it to keep our church alive, to give it vitality? And apparently, even though Teilhard's ideas have been around for a while, people have not taken to them, or they haven't understood them. So my question to him is, how can you make your thought more digestible
Mm.
by the uneducated laity, people who are not theologically educated? What can we do? And I think the answer that he would give would be a very abstract one. And I would ask him, could you make this a little more concrete? How should a priest give a sermon on Sunday that somehow prepares those minds for this great vision of Christ that you've given us? And also Christology. I love Teilhard's cosmic Christology, where Christ is identified as the Omega of the universe. How can you express that in ways that our teachers in seminaries would be burning on fire
Mm.
with that vision? That hasn't happened yet. We need your help to make that real. As it were, only a few theologians have really studied the implications of Teilhard's vision, and they don't talk about it in seminary. So, give us some advice
Yeah.
on how we can make your message heard from the bottom up, and not sound like another top-down uh, type. I think you would also have to agree that you can't really get into his vision unless you have at least some scientific education. And we live in a culture, as you know, and the present regime is an example of it, resistance to evolutionary ideas. And where intelligent design seems more in touch with the minds of the voters for our present president, uh, and the prejudices we have about time as just a small smithereen of eternity is not going to work. So I guess I have this pedagogical questions more than theological ones. So, and what I try to do in my own writing is something I picked up from Whitehead too, and that's to seek simplicity when you're teaching or when you're writing a book, but then show that that's not good enough. Seek simplicity and then mistrust it. Mistrust simplifications. In our religious education as well as our science education, we've sought simplicity, but we haven't allowed the mistrust that opens up the future, that's necessary for opening up the future. So, but I would not question Teilhard's fundamental vision. I think he's right on.
Well, thank you, John. That's very insightful regarding your personal journey with Teilhard, the relevance of his thought today, and really, I think, a beautiful testament to how you have, I think I used the word earlier, but have really interiorized his life and thought in a way that rightfully so makes you one of the foremost scholars of his work. But I mean, I think that, at least for me, you resonate not just on the level of the head, but also the heart too, in terms of just sharing your journey and where you came from, in terms of being initiated into a deeper spirituality, in terms of a more expansive spirituality within Teilhard, and now how you've been such an important person and thinker, and taking up this torch to, like you said, that's our work now going forward. It's more than the theologians' work. It's the common people who also, in some sense, have a resonance with Teilhard that can speak to what it is to embody such cosmic love, such cosmic hope and anticipation, because that's where I've found, as of late, in studying Teilhard for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years or so, whatever it is myself. As of late, like the past few years, I've just been finding such tangible examples within people's lived experience and how they either share that. I mean, maybe we're doing a book study talking about Teilhard, Future of Man or whatever, but then they just share something from their life that puts meat on the bones so much more than, not to discredit Teilhard in his writing, but just for me at least, it fleshes it out. Just witnessing life, right? Witnessing the life of my children and our young family as we grow, with my wife, witnessing life around me in terms of people, in terms of nature. They have just really put the rubber to the road in terms of my cognitive study of Teilhard. So I'm just so grateful for people like yourself that have such a gift of your mind, but also your heart too, and how you really share that in a very holistic way. So thank you so much for that.
Well, it's people like you who give me confidence and hope. So very beautifully put. Thank you.
Well, we're all in this together, right? That's another theme from Teilhard to some degree, that we're all in this together. So we help each other, we serve each other.
So take care of yourself.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And you as well. And just before we part here today with our audience, as I said in your introduction before the podcast started, you are a very accomplished author. Your most recent book that you would want to draw people to is God After Einstein. Is that correct?
Yes. My last two books were on two scientists, Albert Einstein and then on Teilhard de Chardin. And to give myself hope, I am now in the process of beginning another book in which I'm going to put Teilhard and Einstein in conversation with each other, so as to initiate something like what I think Teilhard was hoping to do, to integrate science into faith and faith into science. So
Well, that sounds excellent, and it certainly gives us all something to look forward to. So, John, again, thank you so much. We're very grateful for your support of the American Tarot Association and for joining me today for this conversation. And we pray that it just has a ripple effect for all that might listen to it or watch it.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. Good
All
luck
right.
to you.